So I decided to speak about a particular chronology on Tagus rock art, explaining first a little bit about what is Tagus rock art and the work that we've been doing in the last few years, because it's a new and exciting topic concerning especially Iberian Peninsula rock art chronology, because it's a part of the chronology of prehistory that it's not yet very well delimited, it's not yet very well studied, or there is not many knowledge yet about this part of the chronology in prehistoric times. Therefore, I start by talking a little bit about Tagus itself. Tagus rock art complex, it's considered to be one of the biggest rock art complexes in Iberian Peninsula. It's majority all engravings, and it was found in the early 70s, in 1971, by a group of archaeologists, but it was a discovery by chance. They were not looking for rock art at that time. They were looking for archaeological contexts, much older. And they found in this region of Portugal, in the center of Portugal, already with the border with Spain, a big complex that firstly, they found 40 kilometers of river in the Tagus with many rock art sites. Today, we consider 120 kilometers with engraving sites from the Ocreza River, which is exactly where I'm standing today in location in the Mação municipality, right in the middle of Portugal, until this very edge of Portugal, already with this border with Spain, in a river called Gercês. So today, we consider Tagus rock art complex with 120 kilometers. This is the region that I'm talking about. All this area until here, until this part here, all these dots are rock art sites. And it's very interesting because the first part they found in the 70s, it was only this area, which was already really big. But in the last few years, the few decades, many more sites of rock art has been found, especially in this part of the Gercês River. So, and because of the characteristics, the chronology, typology of rock art that was found here, we are considering all this area as a very big rock art complex. These days, we can only visit 3 sites, and I'm going to explain why. But today it's possible to see the Ocreza River engravings, which is the only place that has the only Paleolithic engraving in the entire Tagus. We can find rock art in Gardet area, which is right in front of the dam that put all the other sites underwater. That is the main problem in Tagus rock art, is that more than 90% of these engravings are underwater these days. And the last site here, right before a second dam that Tagus has, it's also possible to visit a few engravings. But all these sites just present a few rocks that we can today visit, not the entire rock art sites or not all engravings. So what happens in the 70s? And this is very interesting to understand why we are focusing in a certain chronology and how did we get the data to speak about this new chronology these days. In 1971, they found the engravings, but there was a dam right here was being built. So they knew that this dam would put all the rock art sites underwater, or the majority of the rock art sites. But they also realized that these engravings were really different, were really important, and especially the amount of engravings. The size of this complex was really big for the time. And they even then they thought it was really important to work on this. Problem number 2, we were still in a dictatorship, so there was no action to actually prevent or to try to prevent the construction of the dam. It was not possible. The dam was already being built. So what they had to do in a very fast way was to adapt a methodology to these engravings in order to, in 2 years, they had to define a method and work in these 40 kilometers of river to try to make a documentation or some kind of documentation of all these engravings. And they defined a method called the rock surface molding method. So literally they did molding, latex molding casts of the surface of the rocks. Why did they decide to do this? First, they knew that everything was going to be underwater soon. And then this method would allow them to work very fast in a certain amount of time, and then in the laboratory have time to study these casts with a little bit more detail than in the field. In the field, they didn't have time for that. They had to document as much as they could before the dam started working. So they used this different method. They also did many other things in the field. They did prospection along the main river and the tributary rivers around those 40 kilometers of field. They did more or less 1,500 casts of rock art, and they actually admit they didn't have time to do everything. So the amount of engravings that it's known today in Tagus, we know that it's not the entire complex. We know that there's a lot that they literally didn't have time to do, but they managed to do photography, prospection, documentation, the casts. So it was a very big task. It was a very big work. And at least part of this complex is still existing today due to this molding technique. So what is the result of these moldings? This is a very different material. Molding rock art engravings, it's not very common. Not these days. These days we don't use it anymore, of course. But in the 70s, in the 60s, it was more common. There are certain places in the world, I think in North Africa, United States of America, that I know that there are examples of using this technique in rock art. If it was well done, the results would be very good. Obviously, this takes a lot of material and technique. People have to know exactly how to mix the ingredients to make this mold. But the results, if it's well done, it's actually pretty amazing, because everything that is on the surface of the rock would be documented on the molds, and we can actually see a lot of details. Not only the details of the engravings, but also the details of the rock itself, the fractures, the shape of the rock. Everything would be here with a lot of detail. These are some examples of the material that we have today. What happens after Fratel Dam starts working? All the original engravings go underwater, and the archaeologists have this 1,500 molds collection of the rock art of Tagus to study. But because the dam starts to work in 1974, that is the year that we had a lot of political changes in our country, the dictatorship falls, a new era starts, but there's a gap year that actually is very confusing in terms of institutions, of bureaucracy. So this collection is actually stored in the National Museum of Archaeology, and for many years it was not studied. There are a certain amount of monographic studies of some rocks, but nobody did a complete study of the Tagus rock art for many, many years. So in early 2008, 2009, we have here in our institution a project that wants to study one of the remaining sites that are still outside water, the Ocreza River, which belongs to the municipality of Mação, where we have our research center. And in order to do that, to understand Ocreza rock art, we have to understand the entire Tagus rock art. It doesn't make sense to try to understand just a small amount of rocks if we don't have a big notion of what is this part of. So we started by gathering the collection, asking for authorities for the collection of the molds from the 70s, and start from the beginning, which is making a 2D tracing and photography of these latex molds. It's a very big, it was a very big work where many students from master and PhDs also participated. And we decided to use a very old technique of using plastic sheets of a certain size, put together on the mold, imagining if it was a normal rock. So imagining as a rock, the plastic sheet methodology, which is very used, for example, in Valcamonica, in the engravings of Valcamonica and many other sites, we decided that this would be the best method to use, fast, best, and that would give us a very accurate documentation of the molds. Some problems were related. For example, we could only work in the darkness because in order to see the shape of the rock and the shape of the engravings, and in order to know what is an engraving and what is a fracture, we had to be in the darkness with artificial light, and then making the tracing in these conditions. We also decided to go to field work and do normal documentation work in the sites that were still remaining outside water. So, like I said in the beginning, there were 3 sites in this big complex that were still able to show us some engravings that were not flooded by the dam. So we decided also to make work in all the sites that were outside water, even to understand not only the landscape or the context of the sites, but we needed to have a good idea of special details on the rocks, inclination, the color, how the engravings behave in the landscape. So it was also a very good research point to give a big context of everything that we were doing. Then we spent a certain amount of time treating all this material, and this had some rules that would give us a lot of a more easy way after to give us for analysis of the material. What do I mean with this? Organizing the material in for example, in image software treatment programs, depending on how we do it, we can actually then save a lot of time analyzing, for example, overlappings between figures, association of figures, counting how many figures we have per rock. So there was some rules of how we were dealing with making the analysis, digital analysis of this material after. And this gave us a lot of opportunities to make a content analysis. And with this, I mean checking for overlapping of figures, checking for association of figures. And this is very important regarding the chronology of a site. So if you are aware of the overlappings of different styles, of different rock art styles, we can make a better understanding of different chronologies, of what is going on between chronologies in such a big chaos of engravings that we actually had. So this was a very important step, and especially making aware of the association of figures to better understand this site. This is a typical result that we have. So we have the photograph of the cast, the molding cast, and then we have the tracing or drawing, the documentation in 2 dimensions of what is in the cast, and then all the part of digital treatment of the figures. It's another step that gives us a different and better understanding of all this work. Why is this so important? Because having the opportunity to see Tagus rock art from a big perspective, so we had a big corpus, an entire site to work with, give us completely different idea of what is going on in this complex. And while analyzing the figures, it was very important to make a statistical analysis and a very good documentation analysis of everything that we had, especially regarding the typology of figures, the shape, what is the shape, what is the style, what is drawn, and its overlapping. What is overlapping what is associated with what. And making big tables, while we were working on the digital part of the Tagus, it was very easy in the end to see the big picture. This is a lot of work, but actually gives us much more opportunities in the future, because we can, for sure, and in a very accurate way, to say exactly what Tagus rock art has. How many human figures there is, how many animals there is, what is the distribution of each typology of engravings per site is. So this is the best part of dealing with an entire site in just one piece of work, that we can have a very big picture of what is going on. And this gives us also opportunities to see things that normally are very hard to see in such a big site. For example, difference of techniques. How many techniques are used in such a big complex like this? The distribution of the techniques. Where are they using different techniques? Is it a pattern or not? It's just a random localization or a random thing or not? And this is actually, in the end, the amount of information that we have is just amazing. And we can see a lot of things that before, in the chaos of just saying that there's 40 or 100 kilometers of rock art there is. And we also managed to see differences in the way they draw the figures, the way they did the packing of the figures. The biggest majority of the rock art in Tagus is by packing. It's an engraving and packed. But even inside this technique, we saw many differences. And some of those differences have to do with the chronology. So this is also a very important detail about the site. And in the end, what can we say about Tagus? Actually, we got a collection of almost 7,000 engravings divided or spread in 1,636 rocks. And by doing all this work, we could actually see a very big distribution of different typology of figures. So we can actually make a study or an analysis that tells us exactly how many type of figures, from human figures, animal figures, abstract or geometric figures, and a lot of different typologies that also appear in Tagus. And many of these differences in typology has to do with chronology. If we know or if we have knowledge in the, generally speaking, in the prehistoric rock art of Iberian Peninsula, from the typology of rock art, we already can achieve a certain amount of knowledge about the chronology. And we see here that the big majority of rock art in Tagus has to do with schematic rock art. Circles, concentric circles, point lines, waving lines. This is very typical from what is called schematic rock art of Iberian Peninsula, which is a type of rock art that begins in the early Neolithic and it goes more or less until late Bronze Age times, as far as we can achieve now in terms of chronology of schematic rock art. Sorry. If you are interested in seeing the entire corpus of rock art of Tagus, it is possible to download the entire corpus on ResearchGate. And it's easy to see how big, how complex all these rocks are. And even so, if it was a big work, we know that there was much more sites in Tagus, but it was impossible to archaeologists to have time to work on everything. Okay, so giving the big picture of a site, what can we do with this information? Taking into account that we do not have direct datations in rock art, okay, especially in Portugal, is really, really rare, and some efforts are being attempted now, but especially for engravings, it's still difficult or almost, no, I can say almost impossible, because there are certain ways of doing it, but this is an open air rock art site with engravings. Back in the 70s, all these obviously direct datations didn't exist. So what can we do today? We can make a stylistic comparing the style of the engravings with things that we already have in other sites in different contexts. And some of those contexts actually have a way that give us a more detailed datation of these figures, for example, or can point us to a certain chronological context, okay? Not give us an exact datation, because that is really, really hard. And what Tagus tells me, the entire site tells me that we have only one figure that is from Paleolithic rock art, but without a doubt Paleolithic rock art. It's a very small horse that is still outside water in the Ocreza River. Then it tells us that there's a big context of schematic rock art that is very well defined all over Iberian Peninsula, South France, a little bit in Italy. So it's a kind of context that we have a lot of information these days, and we can compare and have absolutely sure that this chronology is very well defined in Tagus. Actually, it's the majority, also with the Bronze Age figures and contexts. And then we also had just a few Roman inscriptions, historic ethnographic figures, but in a very small amount. But what stands out from this very big analysis is that we can see there's a certain amount of figures that have absolutely nothing to do in terms of typology, of the way it was drawn, with the Paleolithic rock art, but it also has nothing to do what is typically the schematic rock art of Iberian Peninsula. So the most important detail about this group of figures is that many of them are overlapped by schematic rock art. So there is a stratigraphy in the figures that gives me a certain amount of figures that are under the schematic rock art of Tagus complex. And why is this important? Because when we analyze, generally speaking, of course, the Iberian Peninsula prehistoric artistic traditions, we can see big groups, okay? We have Upper Paleolithic rock art, both painted and engraved, which is very well defined. It has a very specific characteristics, and it's a completely hunter-gatherer mindset that is going on. Then we have Levantine rock art, which has been discussed for a long time if it is only from what it's called the Mesolithic chronological period, or if it's Neolithic, or if it's both, if it is a tradition that actually covers many different chronological periods. We have schematic rock art, which is a type of rock art manifestation that begins or appears or comes with what it's called the Neolithic mindset. So when Neolithic starts, that actually it's a very big break with the previous chronological periods. We also see it in the rock art. The changes are very, very big also in the rock art way of doing things. And the big characteristic of this kind of rock art that doesn't happen, for example, with Levantine rock art, is that schematic rock art is very human-centered. We still have animals, but actually animals are not the main concern of this rock art. We have a lot of abstract and geometric figures, and we have a lot of human figures, which is something new, taking into account the characteristics of the previous chronologies. So this is completely different. Schematic rock art is very well defined, and if we look at an engraved or painted site, we can actually see very well that is schematic rock art, that what they are representing is completely different from the hunter-gatherer mindset. And then we have many other big sets of rock art. For example, the Atlantic rock art, which is very, it concerns a lot a certain specific location in the northwest of Iberian Peninsula, for example. And then we have Iron Age rock art, which is a completely different mindset too, because it's a much more warrior mindset than anything else. What is the problem of these definitions, generally speaking? You can see here that there are chronological definitions, and we have geographic definitions. Levantine rock art, Atlantic rock art, it's a geographic definition. So it's actually a big mess in terms of defining chronology / location of rock art. And that is a big problem that I think in the future archaeologists and rock art researchers have to speak about. Because right now, the way we look at rock art in Iberian Peninsula, it's a little bit confusing, taking into account the way archaeologists in the past decided to define these big groups of rock art. So what is the problem, for example, in the chronology of the Mesolithic? There's only one set of rock art that it's considered that could be from Mesolithic time. And the problem is that it has a geographic name, it has a geographic definition. Levantine rock art, it's in the east part of Spain. It's a very well characterized rock art, but if we look around in the Iberian Peninsula, it was really, really rare to have sites that can actually say there is rock art from the chronological period after the Paleolithic until the Neolithic times. So there was a gap, and this gap was not very well explained. I don't know if it's just because we have a lot of other chronologies sites, so it's easier, or it's what is more visible to researchers, but there was a big gap. And why is it important to speak about these chronologies, because schematic rock art that comes with early Neolithic, Ghost, Chalcolithic, and Bronze Age times, it's completely spread all over Iberian Peninsula, and it's very well organized and characterized. Every year, something new is found within schematic rock art sites, but at the same time is a type of figures and the mindset that it's very visible and easy to consider. And this is examples of what schematic rock art is. A lot of human figures, some animal figures, but they already are extremely difficult to characterize. What is the main characterization of an animal in schematic rock art? If we don't have physical features like horns or antlers, it is really hard to say which animal it is. For example, it's very different from Paleolithic rock art. Paleolithic rock art, it may even, parts of the animal not exist, but we know exactly what is the animal that it's represented, because it's very equal or very well represented according to natural characteristics of the animals. In schematic rock art, no, it's only the simple shape, body, legs, or head of an animal. We know it is an animal, but many times it's impossible to say what is the species or what is represented. And this goes both to engravings and paintings, okay? Schematic rock art is very well organized and represented in both techniques. And we can literally compare almost to the line sites with paintings and engravings. They are extremely lookalike. And then what stands in the schematic rock art is that it's full of abstract or geometric figures, circles, concentric circles, spirals, circles with lines or points inside. This is the most typical site of schematic rock art that can show us, and it comes by thousands. Tagus has thousands of schematic figures, Guadiana Valley, for example, too, and the thousands of open-air painted shelters that we know both in Portugal and Spain. It's exactly the same features, but in a different technique. Another figure that stands out in the schematic rock art are the sun-shaped figures, along with the human figures. And the chronology is also a little bit, it is quite understandable. It's quite well characterized, because we have figures that are really resemble open-air rock art sites or that come from the megalithic sites. So megalithic sites are being represented with figures that are exactly the same or very similar to open-air sites of the same chronology. So schematic rock art is very well defined in the Iberian Peninsula rock art world. What is not, it's this pre-schematic rock art. So what happens between the end of the Upper Paleolithic rock art and the beginning of the Neolithic? This was a gap in the studies of rock art in the Iberian Peninsula. So what happens in recent years? There are some authors that are starting to find things in rock art sites that have absolutely nothing with the naturalism of the Paleolithic rock art, and has nothing to do with the schematism, with how schematic is the rock art of the Neolithic of Iberian Peninsula. And many times the stratigraphic relation between these figures, it's very visible, and it cannot be ignored in this case. So in Tagus Valley, when we started for having the big picture and starting to occur that there are many figures that have a very singular stratigraphic relation, many of these figures were actually animals. What do I want to say towards the definition? This is still a discussion that is starting, okay? And it's very funny because a few days ago in a congress about rock art of Portugal, I started to see more researchers speaking about, we need to say something about this piece of chronology of rock art. So it's not already just a thing of 4 or 5 authors that are speaking about things that are really hard to characterize because we don't have anything to compare, or we just have a few things to compare. But people are starting to be aware that many things in, for example, late Paleolithic rock art are probably mischaracterized in the chronology, or we really need to study a little bit more the stratigraphic relationship of figures. But it is in 1999 already, or even before in the 80s with Beltrán, with Antonio Beltrán, that some authors start to say there are a style that it's not yet studied, but it should be, that is what happens after or in the end of the Upper Paleolithic rock art. So we already have authors that in 1999 gives it a name, Style 5. This Style 5 was something that was considered for some sites, and recently for a site called Ciega Verde. That is a site that is known for especially the Paleolithic rock art, but there are many figures in this site that have nothing to do with this. So it was considered the last stage of this rock art, probably of Mesolithic times. But before, a few years before, there was an author that already points out that there is, or there was, no rupture between Paleolithic art and later artistic expressions. And he says there are evidence that is emerging, but it's very funny because for many years, this evidence was, I can't say ignored, but it was, I don't know, probably mischaracterized, or people thought it was from different or other chronological periods. In 2003, there is an author that starts by suggesting a description of different criteria that would characterize the rock art of this new cycle of rock art. So it gives us some ideas of the animals are not exactly like the Paleolithic rock art animals, but they have a different way of dealing with the shape of the body. There are certain anatomic details that we have to be aware. There are no details in certain parts of the body, and these characteristics can actually help us to see if there is a new style, or it's not a new style. Where are the proofs that there is no gap of representing rock art after the Paleolithic and the beginning of the Neolithic. So this was really, really interesting. And in the last few years, there are 2 authors from Spain that studied in very much. They work a lot in the Guadiana Valley, the Guadiana River, and in the Tagus River basin, that they have been finding some proofs that actually below, or in the stratigraphy relation with the schematic rock art below, there are a certain amount of figures that can be defined probably as pre-schematic. Why are people calling it pre-schematic and not Mesolithic rock art? Because in terms of the cultural approach to Mesolithic and everything, is really hard to say where it was made exactly. What is actually the chronology of this rock art? So right now, that discussion, I think, is starting to be done right now. The generally name that these authors are suggesting, and I actually took this name for what I found out in Tagus, it's the pre-schematic horizon. So before schematic, we have a certain kind of manifestations that we really have to study. And in Tagus rock art is really, really funny, because even if almost nobody was talking about this, some authors for Tagus since 1989 were already saying, yes, Tagus has a certain amount of animals that could be Epipaleolithic, Mesolithic time. But this was not developed. This was just 2 or 3 publications, always regarding the same 1 or 2 rocks. And one of the main rocks, it's rock number 155 from a fertile site that has a very big collection of animals that are very naturalistic, not as the Paleolithic way of representing, but obviously not as the schematic rock art show us. And many of these animals are overlapped by the schematic rock art. So this was a first attempt towards a definition that actually there's animals from before the schematic rock art. And what the work in Tagus show us, giving us the big picture and using the different criteria of the authors that are already starting to speak about this, we did a big analysis of the animals and the stratigraphic relationship of figures in Tagus. And we are suggesting that there are many more figures in Tagus, not only that big rock 155, that actually show us characteristics that could be of pre-schematic rock art. So what we consider as pre-schematic, it's still a hunter-gatherer mindset, and we see just a few, but many interesting things in Tagus. For example, animals with arrows on the body. So it's like a hunting scene without the people. But we know it's a hunting scene because we just need the animal with a spike on the body to know that he's a hunting scene. We don't need to see the person that did it. This is the example of the animals with the arrows and or spikes on the body that can actually show us that this could be a representation of a hunting scene from a hunting-gatherer mindset. And the mindsets are very important because then there's a completely break of the way they think and behave and believe and live with the Neolithic rock art. So by comparing all the sites that we already have data for, that could be of a pre-schematic chronology, we made a big comparison with everything that we had in Tagus, and we actually came across with many animals that could be considered of a Mesolithic chronology. And not only the shape of the figures, but especially what is going on the top of these figures. There's some evidences of a lot of abstract and geometric figures, typically from schematic rock art, that comes after these big animals. And this is a very important thing to study and to take into account when we are making interpretation of the chronology of the site. And another interesting feature was not only the shape of the figures, not only the overlappings of the figures, but also when I start comparing Tagus rock art figures with typical known Paleolithic rock art sites that until now were considered Paleolithic engravings, actually there are resemblance of the shape of the bodies, of the way they do certain specific details, or the movement of the animals, small anatomic details in the legs of certain animals, a certain tendency to engrave only the heads of certain animals. We also have it in Tagus. Here is a comparison between some figures from Coimbra Valley, which is mainly known for the Paleolithic rock art, and the Tagus Valley. And I would suggest that some of these figures that until today was considered to be Upper Paleolithic rock art could actually be from this transition time. And this could be re-evaluated in a different way, I think. And some of my colleagues from these sites are already start talking about this. The resemble of certain sites, for example, in this site of Ojo Guareña in Spain, there are actually direct datations that give us this Mesolithic chronology, and that gives me also an idea that are resembling of the way of the shape of the animals with figures from Tagus rock art. And this is actually a starting point to say that we could start comparing things and discussing the way archaeologists and rock art researchers give to the name they give to names. For example, I see many resembles from rock art site in figures of Tagus with the Levantine rock art of Spain. The problem is that it's a geographic name that can actually give us a lot of trouble to understand the features of figures, but we can see not very different features of these figures, painted or engravings, in many other sites of Iberian Peninsula. So I think this would be a groundbreaking study to make a very big comparison of sites. One of the features of Upper Paleolithic rock art, and I think it still comes to the Mesolithic rock art, is the way animals are represented with movement. Schematic rock art, the name says it all. It's very schematic. We can see movement, we can see action, we cannot see many things that we can see in the Upper Paleolithic or in the Levantine rock art of the Mesolithic. And in Tagus rock art, I could actually compare how well these figures were being represented, because I can compare them with actually movements and behaviors of animals. And this is a very interesting part. Regarding the first human figures from the Neolithic, this is a discussion that I don't have yet many data to compare, but it's just a suggestion. I think some of the anthropomorphic figures of Tagus, human figures, are actually really old, older than the ones that come after as being schematic. And this being old, I have no idea if it's considered to be early Neolithic representation that mixes its mixture yet with some of the animal representations that I consider to be older. For example, this last representation is a human figure that holds a dead deer on the shoulders, and it's pretty unique in Tagus and gives me a story or many stories that I can see from this picture, but it's definitely not a schematic rock art interpretation. It's not schematic rock art characteristic. So these very movement anthropomorphic figures holding things with the arms open, holding stuff or animals, I believe that this could be the earliest representations of animal figures in Tagus. I'm not yet sure how to put it in the chronological set. This is the hardest part. But if we compare them with some of ceramic, decorated ceramic from early Neolithic sites in Spain, or dated pebbles with paintings also from the early Neolithic sites in Spain, we can actually see some similarities. And regarding the pre-schematic fauna in Tagus, it's not a big amount of data. It's in 7,000 engravings, it's only 148 animals that I believe, or I think, or I would suggest that could be considered of the pre-schematic chronology. Yet, even if it's not a big amount of data, it's really important because it gives us an idea that there is no gap in representing rock art. So there is no rupture from Upper Paleolithic rock art with the Neolithic times. And it's a way of research that I think it will be very important in the future to take into consideration. To finish, I want to say again that I thank you for for watching my presentation and for including me in this amazing program. These are my contacts if anybody is interested in some more research about this. And I finish by saying thank you, or if there's anyone else have any question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sara. It's really amazing. You reconstruct a chronological consequence by the styles of rock art. So it's very nice. And especially without the direct datation. And I have a question. You described the connections between rock art and megalithic art. And
yes.
Do you have any connections or maybe some comparison with mobile art from the sites? It can be more easy to know the direct datation, to use the C14 datation if we have the comparison between rock art and mobile art.
Well, yes, actually, there are a few examples. Speaking in Portugal specifically, there are a few examples that happened. The problem is, for example, we don't have archaeological context for Tagus, and we have just a few archaeological contexts for other sites like Tagus, like, for example, Guadiana Valley, which the chronology is very similar to Tagus, and it has more archaeological context, but not in the site. So what happens in Tagus is that we have a big area with rock art, and we don't have yet direct connection with the sites, with the archaeological sites. So that's the main problem. When we compare with other sites, for example, we have that for Paleolithic rock art in Coimbra Valley. There's a lot of work, not only with mobile art, but with excavations in rock art, in the rocks. So they did the datation of material that are in connection with the engravings, which is awesome. A collection of mobile art was also recently found in another site in Portugal called Sabor River, and those plaquettes, it's actually a very big collection, has rock art from the Upper Paleolithic until, I think, medieval ages or Iron Age rock art. It's amazing. So that is also a good thing to compare. The big problem in this big perspective, it's this period of chronology of what Mesolithic rock art, pre-schematic rock art. That's the big problem. Once, because we don't have many direct datations. We have those sites in Spain that I told about, and the only thing that I can actually now do is a stylistic comparison. But I believe that there are many sites that are considering things to be Upper Paleolithic or Magdalenian in the end of the Upper Paleolithic that could actually be not Upper Paleolithic, but the transition. And as much more as I compare by the style, I am finding more and more evidence, and I see more authors talking about this. So there are many limitations in this study. One of it is the lack of the comparison with the context, the lack of comparison with the mobile art, because we have to have it to make a comparison, and that is it's easier now in the Upper Paleolithic rock art and the schematic rock art, because like I show, the megalithic rock art in megalithic monuments have many similarities with schematic rock art. And there are already some archaeological contexts for schematic rock art. So we have ceramics that are being excavated in the schematic sites. So it's easier. The big problem is this piece of chronology that I think it has to be like a small revolution to check everything again and try to understand how well the chronologies in the Iberian Peninsula are being set.
Thank you. It's very nice. Does anybody have a questions, please? Yes.
I have a question about these geometric figures that you found. what do you think they represent, or how do you interpret them?
Well, that is a question that it's very common, but it's actually really hard. Looking at schematic rock art, things get really tricky because the majority of representations are abstract figures. Many of the studies regarding, and it's very funny because we know it's a part of the time it's a chronological period that we know there are agriculture, there are domestication, there are ceramic things, and we can't find this in the rock art. It's really rare, or maybe later we see agriculture scene or something. But in the typical schematic rock art of Iberian Peninsula, we can see things that we know existed. So it's very hard. It's a completely abstract geometric mindset. I think it could be a way of communicating, because rock art is communication, okay? But for meanings, or group meanings, or original way of doing things. But it's very funny because the same figures appear in a very big area. In all Iberian Peninsula, you can find the same things, for example. So what does a circle means? I would be inventing something to tell you. But I know, for example, there are a big amount of sun-shaped figures and human figures. So it can tell us that there's a different way of thinking, not a hunter-gathered way, but a more self-centric way of thinking. What is the concerns? The concerns changed. The sun is important. Why? Agriculture issues. It's important to be aware. Probably they are more aware of themselves than it's important to paint a hunter scene. Yes, also. But then there's a lot of just abstract things that would have a meaning for them, but it's complete. We cannot achieve the meaning of a circle or a triangle. It's really hard on that. What we can see these days, and many studies are made on that, is, for example, the relationship with landscape. The location of the sites are very connected with landscape features. Many painted sites in Spain, for example, have to do with researchers think they have to do with water lines and resources and where animals were passing by. So there's a big awareness of territory, controlling territory in the sense of resources, for example. And I think the way we better understand schematic rock art, it has to do a lot with where it is located, because we see a lot of things in very high, in the mountains, in the open air shelters that give us a very, very good view of what is surrounding us in terms of landscape. So this is some ways of understanding schematic rock art. But if you tell me what does a circle mean in the middle of 4,000, I can literally give you that. I don't have enough knowledge to tell you what that means.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay. As I understand, the discussion is over. Congratulations, Sara. Thank you very much for your very nice lecture, for your interesting presentation.
Thank you for the invitation.
Okay. Keep in touch for future projects.
Sure, yes.
Okay. So thank everybody for presence, for listening, and goodbye.